Okay, metabolism. Last chapter. This is the last lecture for the first test. Okay, and first test will be a week from today. Unfortunately, we don't meet next Tuesday because of in-service. Okay. I think it's kind of in some ways it's a review chapter, but it also is kind of a garbage chapter where they threw a bunch of stuff that I guess has to be said sometime during A&P, but sometimes it's not clear where you say some of this stuff. So that's the way I feel about the way this chapter works. This is pretty typical. I don't know what made me take a picture of this, but I always try to look for things that have to do with nursing, since so many of my students are nurses. Here's 2/3 of the front page, this whole article here, and then this one down here, it has to do with a bunch of nursing issues as well. And pretty cool profession that y'all are seeking to go into. There you go. Somebody fell or got themselves hurt on Portland Bridge Pedal. Have y'all ever done that? Any of y'all ever done the Bridge Pedal ride? I would highly recommend it to you sometime. I've ridden it 5 or 6 times probably. It's the one day in the year that they close all the bridges in Portland down, and you can ride across them on your bike. And it's really neat to see Portland from the bridges. Because you, like the freeway bridge, you buzz across it at 70 miles an hour and never really look. But now you can stop. They have bands playing on the top of the bridge and refreshments set up and stuff like that. And if you do all, I think it's 11 bridges now. It used to be 10, and now it's 11 because of the new one. It's a pretty long ride because you have to go all the way up to St. John's and then all the way down to Selwood. And then all the ones in between. It's a really cool thing. It's not very much money. It's a donation to Providence. They organize the whole thing. All right. So metabolism is it's a term that refers to all of the chemical reactions that are going on in your body at any one time. And since we just finished studying digestion and respiration, those are certainly 2 of the big sets of metabolism that are going on. Cellular metabolism clearly means the chemical reactions that are going on within the cells to provide energy and to provide the energy to push the chemical reactions that go on in our body all the time to make new cells, to replace cells, to heal things, and so forth. We break down stuff in order, organic molecules. We've talked about them a little bit. Carbohydrates, fats, proteins. We burn those all 3 of those up to generate ATP, and then but most of that actual energy production, as you know, takes place in the mitochondria. This actually is a pretty good slide right here because, and I would recommend you all take a close look at this in the book, because in many ways it summarizes the whole deal. It's very schematic. If you think of this pink thing here as the plasma membrane, the cell membrane. So this is outside of the cell, out here, called the interstitial fluid, obviously. And inside the plasma membrane is the cytoplasm, the juices that are inside the cell. And then you think that, we eat stuff and we absorbed it through the wall of our intestine, and it got in the bloodstream, and then it got out of the bloodstream and got into the interstitial fluid, and now we have to take it in. And so here they are, amino acids, lipids, and simple sugars. Obviously, amino acids are a breakdown product of proteins, lipids are fats, and simple sugars. We break down complex carbohydrates and stuff like that to make simple sugars, and we then pull it in across our cell membrane into the cell. And in the cell, once again, remember this is kind of schematic, but they all become members of the nutrient pool. the nutrient pool that we're going to live off of. And off of that, we do several things with the substances that are in the nutrient pool. Some of them we take and we do anabolism. We build them up. We synthesize bigger and bigger chemicals, and we build up new proteins and new stuff in order to maintain and repair things, to grow, to make all the secretions that our body has to make. And then we store stuff. Some of us store a lot more than others. And then what we do, once we get all that stuff made, then we also start breaking things down, and that's called catabolism. And catabolism, when we do break that stuff down, we take the parts that we broke them down to and put them back into the nutrient pool. So great. We also, out of the nutrient pool, we're continually sucking things over here into catabolism. Catabolism takes place in the mitochondria, and of course in the mitochondria is where we're making ATP. And please notice that of all the ATP we make, we use about 40% of it goes to do all these things, like locomotion, enables us to move and contract our muscles, and contract things, intercellular transport, cytokinesis to split the cells, endocytosis to pull things into the cell, and exocytosis to push things out of the cell. And remember, those are all active processes, so therefore they all take energy. But this is the number that always amazes me about this slide, is this one right here, in that 60% of all of the energy that we make through catabolism goes to do nothing but make heat. And you may think, wait a minute. You mean 60% of all the food and stuff we eat just goes to keep us warm? Yes, that's true. Now think about the little energy fire that you all have going in you right now, and I have going in me, because my body temperature is 98.6, y'all's is too, yet this room is 72, and that's, you know, some days it's hotter, some days it's cooler, but nonetheless, we keep our bodies about 20, almost 30 degrees warmer than normal room temperature. Let's say normal room temperature is 70, and we keep our body at 98.6. Well, that's 28.6 degrees that we have to continually be heating our body up. And so just kind of keep that in mind as we go through this chapter. I think it's pretty interesting. So catabolism is the breakdown of these organic substances. They release, we make a lot of ATP with them. Anabolism, as I mentioned already, is just a synthesis of little things into big things. I'll leave it at that. Think of anabolism as an uphill process. In other words, we're building things together, we're supplying energy, we're throwing ATP in there to make it all happen, and we're getting bigger. That's anabolism. We're making bigger things. Think anabolic steroids. Go to the store, you can buy them. Anabolic is the reason that they're there is to people want to take that stuff to build more muscle, to gain weight, all of these kind of things. They want to push it uphill even faster, so they take anabolic steroids, but that's where the word comes from. The compounds that we talk about, I've already mentioned these. Glycogen is the most important storage form of carbohydrate, and remember that glycogen is nothing more than a bunch of molecules of glucose just hooked together in long chains, and it's branched. We store a lot of glycogen in our muscles. We store a lot in our liver. Those are the two main places. But we can't store all that much just on scene like that. And you know, the other day was the Boston Marathon, and the Boston Marathon is always decided sort of on this region, which is called Heartbreak Hill, which isn't a hill. It's a series of about 4 little hills. For Oregonians, it's not a hill, it's a little mound. But for those East Coasters, they must think they're big mountains or something. But the point is, they come at about the 20-mile mark of the race. And at 20 miles, you've burned up, you're right at the point at least of burning up all your glycogen. So you're having to change your metabolism at that point, and that's why a lot of people just poop out at the 20-mile mark, and the guy who wins the race is usually the guy who did the best on Heartbreak Hill and didn't suffer that big setback from lack of energy. Triglycerides obviously is the most abundant form of storage lipid. That's how we store fat in our fat cells in the form of fatty acids. Proteins are the most abundant organic compound in the body, and clearly, they do everything from design our DNA. They get designed by DNA, I should say, to being hormones and all kinds of things that proteins are. Please look at this diagram. Once again, a very diagrammatic thing, but if you just get the big concepts here, that's what I want you to get. So here's these little structural things up here, these storage components: triglycerides, which is fat; glycogen, which is the branched glucoses; and proteins. And we can break those down if we need to put them in our nutrient pool, because the nutrient pool can't burn big glycogen, it can't burn big triglycerides, but it can burn fatty acids, it can burn glucose, and it can burn amino acids, which is the building blocks of proteins, right? So notice that these three things right here all have relatively short carbon chains. Amino acids, you've seen a list of the 26 or 24, whatever it is, amino acids that we have. Most of them don't have more than 6 carbons in a chain. Glucose is 6 carbons in a chain. Fatty acids, a lot of them are 10 or 12, 14 fatty acids long. But nonetheless, we break them down so that we can use them in the mitochondria. And the mitochondria burns these short carbon chains up, and basically it tears the bonds apart, the carbon-to-carbon bonds, and when the bonds are broken apart, they release a bunch of energy. And so those small carbon chains are put into the tricarboxylic acid cycle, also called the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle produces CO2 as a waste product. It breaks these carbons down into mostly 2 and 3 carbon units, where they're, with a bunch of coenzymes, they're put into what we call the electron transport system. You've heard of it before, I'm sure. And the electron transport system, in the presence of oxygen, generates a lot of ATP. I believe 34 or 36 ATPs from every molecule of glucose, for example, and gives off some water. So, a couple more terms that you just ought to know. You ought to know that glycolysis is just simply breaking apart glucose. Glycolysis is nothing more than breaking up 6 carbon chains of glucose. Remember, glucose is kind of a hexagon. They're in a loop of 6. Breaks it into 2 3-carbon pyruvic acids. And then when you have the 3-carbon long pyruvic acids, it turns into pyruvate, and then that's what enters the tricarboxylic acid cycle. And no, I'm not going to make you learn the tricarboxylic acid cycle, because you would remember it less than 8 hours. I know that because I think I memorized it 6 or 7 times in my academic career and proceeded to forget it the next day every single time. And I'm not going to make you do that, because that was stupid. So here it is right here. Here's the tricarboxylic acid. You don't need to know the names of anything. I think the concept that's important is the fact that it's mostly 3 and 4 carbon sugars that come in here, and they gradually get broken down. They circle around and then go back in and get some more carbons taken off. And in the process of all of that, they make a lot of ATP is thrown off. If there was any one number I'd want you to know, this is it. You need to know that for every 1 molecule of glucose, for every 1 molecule of sugar, your cell should gain about 36 molecules of ATP. Now, you can break them up any way you want. About 2 of them come from glycolysis, just from splitting the glucose in half, and then there's some NADH generated, and then you get a couple from the tricarboxylic acid cycle itself, but then 28 of them come from that electron transport chain in the mitochondria. So just know this number right here, 36. And if you go through a bunch of biology books, you'll probably find some that say 32 and some that say 38. So if you've heard another number, don't worry about it. We're going to use 36. All right, so here's another term that you ought to have some basic understanding of. It's called gluconeogenesis. Well, think about it. Gluco is glucose. We're going to make new glucose, neoglucose. Gluconeogenesis means making things. You remember Genesis in the Bible is when they made the earth in 7 days and all that fairy tale. But anyway, we won't discuss that. I don't know what made it come up on my page the other day, but I got this thing of George Carlin. And you remember George Carlin? He was the hippy-dippy weatherman years and years ago, but he was a comedian, and he was absolutely hilarious. And he was talking about Genesis, and I was just rolling. It was hilarious. Anyway, you gotta laugh about some of this stuff. Yeah. So what gluconeogenesis is? It's the making of glucose from non-glucose stuff. Okay. Now what that means is you can take lactic acid, you can take glycerol, and you can take amino acids, none of which are sugar, right? But you can break those up and put them together and make glucose out of them. Now, that's not a good way to make glucose. It's a lot better to just eat it, and break it down and have it to digest and have it to burn. But if we're in a starvation state and we don't have glucose readily available, we can tear our body down, tear down our lactic acid, glycerol, or amino acids, or proteins, and make more glucose. Because we have to have glucose all the time. That's the only source of fuel our brain can use, is glucose. It can't burn fats. Our brain cannot burn proteins. It can only burn glucose. So we got to do it. So if you make a bunch of this stuff, you can store it in your liver for a while, and that's lovely. But just know that gluconeogenesis is a good thing, but it's also an expensive way to get the glucose that you need. Glycogenolysis is simply breaking down the glycogen. Remember, glycogen is nothing but a big long chain of a bunch of glucose molecules, and so breaking those glucose molecules apart is easy and quick. It's a single enzymatic step. Our body can burn up our glycogen really well, and that's what we want to be doing. And indeed, that's what those marathon runners are doing for the first 20 miles, because they've got enough glycogen stored in their muscles and liver to burn, and that's what they do first. On the other hand, we all wish that we could burn fat as well as we can burn glucose, right? But we can't. We just aren't good enough, and burning fat is harder to do. It involves a number of steps, yet we have tons of the stuff stored. I'm carrying about 25 pounds around my waist, and I just love having all those triglycerides. They are the most abundant lipid in our body, certainly the most in mine. But anyway, enough said for that. So how do we get energy from fat? Well, remember what triglycerides look like? You guys remember that from 112? We've got this thing over here on this end, which is called glycerin. And then attached to it, it's got these fatty acids. Remember that? And you remember some of them were saturated so that all the bonds were there, and some of them were kind of unsaturated, and they had some double bonds in there, which meant they didn't have all the H's they could have had on. And so there was saturated fats, which are like animal fats that aren't so great for us, and then there's unsaturated fats that are better for us, things like canola oil and corn oil and so forth. All right. Just remember the basics of it. So the way we burn these things up is we just start lopping these guys off 2 at a time. So we burn them up 2 at a time. Each 2-carbon fragment that we tear off from a fatty acid gains us about 12 ATPs, 5 ATPs. In other words, from a single 18-carbon fatty acid molecule, we can get 144 ATP. And that's a lot, remember, because from a glucose, which is 6 carbons, we got 36. And so this is why we get so much more from fats. And another number that you ought to know out of this lecture here, and I think we come back to it, but remember that carbos, if you're counting calories, carbos, how many calories per gram? About 4. And proteins, about 4. And fats, ouch, about 9. And that's why fatty food that we eat counts up the calories so fast, and that's why fried food, of course, fried really throws it up there. So just know that fats do hold more energy per gram, and I'll just leave it at that. But one good thing about being fat like me is when the Holocaust comes or something, I'm going to outlive a lot of y'all because I've got these extra energy sources that I can save and use. They can make lots of ATP, but they can only do it slowly, which is nice because if we get starved or something, I'm going to outlive all of you. So it saves space. That's a good thing. Another good thing about fat, saves space. But the fat is hard to get to. It's because it's fat, and because it's in big droplets. Remember those lipid cells, those lipocytes, those signet ring cells. They have to be kind of broken down, and it's not a fast process, and that's why it's so hard to lose weight, is because it is hard to burn fat. We have these hormones that we need to make, and we need to make those out of lipids. All of our steroid hormones, all of our sex hormones, all of our hormones, that growth hormones, and all those things. They're made out of fat. They're made out of lipids, and so we need fat in our diet. And every time I hear about some parent who put their kid on a low-fat diet, that's like the worst thing you can ever do to a kid, because a kid, when they're young, they are building up their brain, which is the most important thing they've got to build up. And their brain is almost pure fat. That's. Oh, come on in if you like. We're talking fat. She's so skinny. Anyway, so one of the things that makes fat slow to eat up is that it's not soluble in water. And remember, our blood, which we use to pick up everything, is water. And so we need we need lipoproteins to carry lipids. We can't just float lipids around in our bloodstream. There's a couple of exceptions, but we don't much. Most of our fatty acids are always transported hooked onto a lipoprotein. Now, this is something you've heard about, but probably hadn't really thought about. Lipoproteins are these a complex made up of a lipid and a protein. And by being attached to a protein, then it becomes soluble and then it can float around in the blood. Okay? So that's how we get these big insoluble glycerides and cholesterol into the bloodstream so we can move it around. There's 5 basic classes of them. I don't think you need to know too much about these. Know that chylomicrons are just pure fat droplets. You see those, remember when we talked about the digestive system and how the lacteals can actually absorb chylomicrons, little droplets of fat, but that doesn't stick around. Gosh, I've done something bad. Doesn't stick along as that for very long. Then there's the 4 classes here, the very low density lipoproteins, intermediate density, low density, and high density. Well, which are the good ones? HDLs are good. These are increasingly bad as you go down. Okay, so when you get your lipids checked and you get your cholesterol checked, you want your HDLs to be nice and high. You want your VDLs, VLDLs, and your IDLs and your LDLs to be low. That's all I care that you know about here. Well, one of the problems is you can't really eat any kind of special diet that will raise your HDLs. About the only thing that will raise your HDLs is exercise. And I am a perfect example of a guy who can exercise an hour or so every day. I mean, I was on a treadmill for an hour this morning before I came to school, and I exercise almost 7 days a week, and I can't get my HDLs to come up. Now, I can take pills, I take a Crestor, and it lowers these other ones down so low they can hardly detect them, and they keep telling me, you better back off on that Crestor because you don't have any lipids in your blood. That's okay. I got a brother-in-law who's got, LDLs of 350, and mine are 30. So anyway. So chylomicrons, just for a second, these are the ones that are produced in the intestinal tract. I mentioned they're pretty big. They won't really diffuse into the capillary walls. They won't come into the bloodstream, but they will enter the lymphatics. Remember the lacteals that we talked about. From the lacteals, they go up through the lymphatic ducts up to the thoracic duct, which runs up through the chest and then empties into the venous system right up here in your neck at the junction of the the one coming from your arm, brachial and carotid, subclavian carotid, yeah. And once it gets into the stream, the lymph flows into the stream right there, and then the body pumps it around everywhere. So, just as a description here, these chylomicrons are absorbed through the intestinal tract like this, go up through the thoracic duct into the subclavian vein right there, go around through the carotid system, go through all the capillaries in your body and all your muscles and stuff, and you store any extra ones in the adipose cells, and your liver works on them. But the problem is that we also take and lay a bunch of these lipids down in the walls of our blood vessels. And the number one disease in the world, certainly the number one disease in industrialized countries like the United States, is arteriosclerosis, which is a buildup of the fats in the wall of the capillaries right here. And if that occurs in your coronary arteries that carry blood to your heart, that leads to heart attacks. If it occurs in the arteries going to your brain, that leads to strokes. If it occurs in the arteries going to your legs, it leads to peripheral vascular disease and sometimes leg loss or amputation. If it occurs in the arteries going to your kidneys, it can lead to really bad high blood pressure. Just understand that cholesterol buildup in the walls of arteries is the #1 killer in the world by far. The guy who invents a pill that will not only prevent arteriosclerosis from progressing, but will actually cause it to dissolve away, will make more money than God. He will win more Nobel Prizes than Linus Pauling. The world will be a rut to his door. It'll be amazing because that's the missing link in curing all of these diseases, is finding something that will cause that not to happen. Yeah.
So, and that was gonna be my question. If you live a lifestyle where you've built up that in your arteries, and you do a radical change with exercise and diet, can that be reversed?
Well, it would only make sense that it could be reversed, but the fact is, as long as it doesn't get worse, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Right? And if you continue to exercise, then you build up your muscles, you probably build up the blood supply, the number of arteries going to your muscles and things like that, and that's all a good thing, but no, we haven't, no medicine that people have taken has been shown, statistically shown, to actually dissolve it away. Proteins, let's talk about proteins for a while here. Body makes about 120, 140,000 different proteins, everything from hemoglobin to keratin to myelin, every one of those proteins has got a different form, function, structure. We have a grand total of 20 amino acids. I thought it was a couple more than that, but maybe not. I guess it's 20. Every time we have a protein in our body that we break down, we recycle the amino acids out of it. We don't want to pee proteins out or pee amino acids out or excrete them in our feces or sweat them out or anything. We want to break them down into the amino acids, recycle them, put them back in the nutrient pool, and use them again. And that's the way we do it. Once we have free amino acids, then we can synthesize them into new proteins, and that's what our body does every day. Now, what about if we don't have any fat to burn and we don't have any sugar to burn, and now we're down to breaking down proteins or eating amino acids up? Well, we can do it, and we can put amino acids into the tricarboxylic acid cycle, as it says right here, but that's not a very efficient form of making sugar or nutrients for us to use. Some of the amino acids enter the cycle at different points, so the amount of ATP that actually generates is different depending on which exactly amino acid it is, but I'll just leave it at that. Here's an example, and the reason we're going to talk about this for a second is because here's a process that you do need to understand. Let's take an amino acid like this one. This is one of the 20 amino acids. It's glutamic acid is the name of the amino acid. And you notice that it has 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons in a chain. Okay? Now the thing that makes it an amino acid is because it has this NH2CH grouping right here. That's what makes it an amino acid. Every amino acid has that little piece to it. And what happens is whenever we want to break down amino acids and burn them up, this is what we do. We add a little water to it, we burn a little NAD up, and we convert it into something that looks like this. And you notice that what we did here was we basically took this NH2 off. We added 2 more hydrogens to it. Well, here's 2 hydrogens right here in that water, right? And we created this stuff over here. We created an ammonium ion, which is NH4, and we created this. Now, this is an amino acid minus the amino group, basically, and it's called a keto acid. You guys haven't had organic chemistry, or at least most of you, I'm sure, haven't. Organic chemistry would tell you, you would know that C double bond O is a ketone group. Ketones are a bunch of compounds that we have in our body, but they're not very good for us. But this is the basic process of deamination. And so if we're going to start burning up proteins and making energy out of them, we're going to do this. The problem is that this thing right here, this ammonium ion, is extremely toxic to us. Ammonium is very toxic in our bodies, and we've got to get rid of it. So, even in very low concentrations, they're toxic. Liver cells are the main place that this can happen and break these things down. What we want to do with ammonium ions is we want to take them and break them down and synthesize them into urea. Urea is water soluble and urea is not toxic. Okay, we all have urea in our body, and the nice thing is we can pee urea out. You've probably heard the term BUN, blood urea nitrogen. It's a measurement of kidney function. You've even probably heard UUN, which is urine urea nitrogen, which is done to collect a 24-hour urine on somebody and check a UUN and see how much urea they're actually excreting in their urine. It's another more careful measurement of kidney function, which we'll talk about next. So, how do we get rid of this ammonium ion? Well, we do it by this little trick called the urea cycle. And you don't have to memorize the urea cycle either. Just know that ammonium ions get converted to urea, so they're no longer toxic, and then they can be excreted in the urine. Because urea is water soluble and non-toxic. And I've just mentioned BUN to you. So here's kind of what it looks like. Once again, very schematic. I just want you to know the big concepts here. Ammonium ions plus carbon dioxide go into the urea cycle. The urea cycle basically takes place in the liver and then kicks it out here as this structure right here. And that, I don't think you need to be able to draw that, but you should recognize it. Notice that it's an NH2 group here, a nitrogen group there, an NH2 group there, carbon in between attached to a double bonded to an O. That is urea. And remember, urea is non-toxic and water soluble, so we can get rid of it. And indeed, this is the way our body gets rid of nitrogen when nitrogen is building up in our body for some reason or another. We get rid of it by converting it to urea and then excreting it through our urine. Let me go back to that and just say that I mentioned that ammonium ions are very toxic. The only people that I've ever seen that had a buildup of ammonium ions or ammonia in their blood are people that had really bad liver failure. And that's the people, if any of y'all work in nursing homes, you've probably got a couple of little geezers laying around in the nursing home that are really out of it. And they probably got bellies that are out to here because they have ascites, fluid builds up in their belly. They have cirrhosis, either due to alcohol or hepatitis or some other disease. And they're kind of whacked out part of the day. They come in and out because they have this ammonia in their bloodstream. And ammonium, like I said, is very toxic. It makes you so you can't think. Anybody had any experience with a person like that? Yeah, once you see it, you'll never miss it. It's so weird. Okay. So we can, as we've said, we can break down internal proteins, try to do this gluconeogenesis in the process of turning amino acids into glucose. We've got to deaminate all the amino acids, and then we can break. Once we've got the amino acids off, the NH2 groups off, then we can break down the carbon bonds. You know, that one I just showed you, the glutamic acid had 4 carbons in a row. So you can break those 4 carbon bonds down and get and that'll generate some more ATP for you there as well. Why do we not want to use proteins to burn energy, to make energy? 3 things. Pretty simple if you think about it. One of them is that you have worked your butt off to build proteins. Synthesizing proteins, you remember all that messenger RNA going out to the ribosomes and those triplets coming in and creating, and bringing these amino acids in exact order, hooking them up by peptide bonds to make groups of amino acids that get longer and longer until they become proteins. Every one of those steps requires a lot of energy. So to make proteins requires a lot of energy. So you don't just willy-nilly want to start tearing down your own proteins. That's the number 1 reason. The number 2 reason is every time you tear down proteins, you're going to release all these ammonium ions in your body, which is toxic to you. But as long as your liver is working decently, you can handle that. But it's still another energy-wasting step to go through the urea cycle, turn that ammonium ion into urea so that you can excrete it in your urine. And the simple fact is proteins are the most important structural and functional component that we have. In other words, if you have to start burning up your muscle cells, for example, you can no longer run. You can no longer fight the tiger. You can no longer, do the fight or flight thing. Your body is really getting weaker. Your ribs are starting to show. You're losing muscle. It's a bad deal. So that's why we always try to burn protein the very last. So how do we make these proteins? Well, we've kind of talked about it a little bit. I know you've learned it in previous classes. But we have about half of the amino acids that we need to build proteins. We have to build them ourselves. We have others that are non-essential that can be made by the body. Essential ones we just have to eat. And eating a decent diet will provide you with the amino acids you need. You don't have to be taking protein supplements to get the amino acids that you need. 10 amino acids, please don't memorize these lists. Isoleucine, leucine, lysine, threonine, tryptophan, phenylalanine, valine, methionine, and 2 of them we don't make much, arginine and histidine. And I have to tell you guys that every time I look at that list, I don't remember them. I mean, I don't think about, man, am I getting enough tryptophan to eat? And am I getting enough leucine, lysine? In fact, it has to come back to me that, oh, wait a minute, those are amino acids. Those little tiny building blocks that we make proteins out of, right? But, so we have 10 of them that are essential, and we have some that aren't. And I think I've got a list of them here somewhere. I guess not. Okay. Well, this is the chapter on metabolism, so we got to have some metabolic tissues where most of this metabolism goes on. And I think if I taught you anything at all when we were talking about the liver last week, it's that the liver is really the headquarters of almost all metabolism, all anabolism, catabolism, all the factories that make stuff live in our liver. It's very important to us. But fat tissue is a metabolic tissue as well. Certainly muscle is. Muscle is not only needs lots of energy, but it can store glycogen. Neural tissues are very active. Our brain is constantly is a flurry of metabolic activity in order to allow us to think. There's some other peripheral tissues as well. Talk for just a minute about ketone bodies. Remember I showed you a picture of ketone bodies a minute ago when we took the nitrogens off and we ended up with some ketone bodies. The biggest ones are acetone. You ladies have probably used acetone to take your fingernail polish off, right? That's the major component of fingernail polish remover. It kind of has a sweet smell, and indeed all of the ketones kind of smell sweet. And the reason so here they are: acetoacetate, acetone, beta-hydroxybutyrate. I couldn't remember those three if you asked me to, so don't you memorize them. Just know that we don't really catabolize ketone bodies. Once we've got them, we're sort of stuck with them. We try to turn them back into acetyl coenzyme A and turn them back in and then reprocess them through the tricarboxylic acid cycle. Sometimes that works good, sometimes it doesn't. We have a limited amount of ketone breakdown that we can do in our body. So if we're making too many ketones, and probably the most common place you see that in medicine is in the diabetic who's out of control and their blood sugar is really high and they have a real buildup of ketone bodies. So not only does their sugar go up, but their ketones go up. They get fruity breath. If you've never smelled a diabetic in crisis, try to bend over close to them and smell their breath because it smells like these ketone bodies because they have lots of them in their bloodstream and you can smell them. We call that ketonemia. Ketonemia means ketones in the plasma, basically. It's also acidic. Ketones are somewhat acidic, so when people get too many ketones, they eventually have ketoacidosis. And indeed, that's the worst stage of diabetic crisis, when their ketones build up and they become ketotic and they become ketoacidotic because the acids are building up as well. And they can have pHs. I mean, they can have blood sugars up in the 1800 range. Normal is less than 100. They can have ketone bodies that are really high. And look at this, their pH, because of this acid, can drop really low. Now, what's normal pH? 7.40, really. 7.40 is normal pH. And when your pH gets that low, I can promise you are in coma if you are not dead. Okay, because severe acidosis, and 7.05 is a very severe acidosis. Those people are really sick because it will not only cause coma, which then means they don't breathe enough. They can develop cardiac arrhythmias or abnormal heart rhythms and death quite easily. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that. Homeostasis is something we always strive for. We've been talking about homeostasis since day one of 231. It was one of those concepts we said the whole body really exists to maintain homeostasis, right? And when we talk about nutrition, this is going to be your big nutrition lecture from Sessions. It's going to be short, trust me. The only way we can maintain normal hemostasis is if we eat every day what we need. So we take it in, we use it up, and we get rid of the wastes, okay? And it all should balance out every day. That's what good nutrition, I guess, is all about. Nutrition is basically the absorption of nutrients from our food, and we have different requirements for every nutrient. Well, this is a big deal, especially if you work for the government, and especially if you work for the FDA, or not the FDA, but the agriculture people and all the home ec ladies who come up with the food pyramid. The food pyramid has changed 26 times, I think, in the last 40 years or so, because we just don't know what's really right. I mean, what do you really need to eat, and so forth. But basically, this My Pyramid plan is the latest generation of foods. And there was about 2 months ago they changed it again. Said, we need to eat a little more. We need to eat less fat and more protein, or something like that. So it's always being debated. But you got to have some water too to replace urine, feces, and evaporation. Well, duh. Here's a nice picture of it with grains and vegetables and fruits and milk. And please don't go memorizing this either, because it'll change. No telling what the Republicans will do to it. Well, the Democrats changed it too, so it's a government thing. Nitrogen atoms, remember, we have lots of nitrogen in our atmosphere. 80% of the air we breathe is nitrogen. And yet sometimes people don't get enough nitrogen. And that's because we can't take nitrogen in from the air and use it. Okay? The only thing we can do is take nitrogen in with our food. And the best way for us to get nitrogen in our body is to eat proteins, because remember, they have lots of nitrogen from the amino acids. So we have a concept that you'll hear about even if you're working in a nursing home probably, because it's a pretty low-tech thing, and that is nitrogen balance. We all want to be in nitrogen balance. Nitrogen balance is a good thing. If we're taking in too much nitrogen, we're putting on muscle, we're getting bigger, we're growing. Kids need to be in positive nitrogen balance because they need it to use to build building blocks and make themselves grow in 12 ways or something. So positive nitrogen balance is a good thing, especially in this group right here, growing children, athletes, and pregnant women. Okay? Negative nitrogen balance is something you don't often want to be on unless you're on some major starvation diet thing. Then you want to be in that. You're trying to be in negative nitrogen balance. It's potential problems, though, of course, as well. You should know, I don't want you to learn vitamins, really, but here's an easy thing to remember. These are the fat-soluble vitamins, and fat-soluble vitamins are important to us. We need them. The bad thing about fat-soluble vitamins is you can overdose on them. These are the 4 that you can actually overdose on vitamins. So A, D, E, and K, ADEC, A, D, E, and K, are the 4 vitamins that can become toxic if we take too much, because we store it, we fill it up in our lipids and our so forth, and we can store it and store it and store it until we get to the point where we can't store it anymore. Let's give you a brief little summary of what these different vitamins do for you. You remember vitamin A is a very important part of this chemical called retinal. And remember, retinal is when the light comes into your retina, it turns the retinal from being cis-retinal to being trans-retinal. It changes the shape of the molecule a little bit, and that's what allows us to see. Okay, so that's why. And where do we get vitamin A? Well, a good place to get it is in carrots, right? So your mother always said, eat your carrots so you can see good and see well, I guess. And so that's vitamin A, retinal, vision, carrots. Vitamin D is one of those you've been hearing since the first few weeks of A&P also, because we had this stuff, vitamin D, remember, was processed, and it was important in helping us absorb our calcium. And remember, we showed you a picture of the kid with the bow legs, and he had a disease called rickets. That's right, and that was kids who didn't have enough vitamin D back in the day. And one of the really good things that the government did was they had the milk producers in America start putting vitamin D into every half gallon of milk that you buy. So when you buy a carton of milk, go look at it tonight. Next time you buy one, and it'll say, fortified with vitamin D. And that has just solved this problem for Americans. We use the vitamin D to convert the calcitriol, which increases the rate of calcium absorption in the digestive tract. And lack of calcium is a huge problem, especially in us as we get to menopause or menopause, either one, and we don't have enough sex hormones to make us absorb enough vitamin D. So that's why osteoporosis becomes such a problem. And I bet you right now you could go up to St. Vincent's Hospital up the street here and you'd probably find 50 old ladies on a couple of wards up there that have broken hips. And remember, it's not that they fell and broke their hip. It's that they broke their hip and then they fell. Because that's what usually happens in osteoporosis. The bones just get so weak that they just crack. And tough problem. Vitamin E. A few years ago, everybody thought this was the vitamin that would make you live forever and keep you young forever and all this good stuff. Well, I think it's a good vitamin, but I think most of that has been poo-pooed. Vitamin K is the last one. It's of the four. It's very important. The biggest one are the clotting factors. So if you take warfarin, warfarin is the blood thinner that people take if they have had a blood clot or a bunch of medical problems. You take warfarin, and what warfarin does is it makes it so you can't synthesize these proteins, so your blood stays thin, okay? And you don't clot, have more troubles. And when those folks come into the hospital and they're bleeding from something, you can give them vitamin K, and you can reverse that effect in about 2 hours. Give them a shot of vitamin K, and they'll stop bleeding. You can thicken up their blood quite quickly. Nice little chart, which I never looked at. And I don't want y'all to, at least here in class. There are a series of water-soluble vitamins that we should know just a touch about. These guys, it's not a big deal if you take too many of these because you just pee them right out. They're water-soluble, and who was this guy who thought if you just took enough vitamin C, you'd never get a cold? What was his name? He was from Fossil, Oregon, I think, and he's the only guy that's ever won 2 Nobel Prizes by himself. He went to Oregon State. His name is Linus Pauling. Heard of him? Never heard of Linus Pauling? He is the only man on the face of the earth that has ever won 2 Nobel Prizes in his own name. And what did he get them for? He got the first one for some physics thing about gravity or something. And the second one he got was for arguing against the war in Vietnam. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in his own name because he just raised hell about the Vietnam War for about 12 years before we finally got out of that mess. Anyway, we have to throw in a little politics here from time to time. I'm sorry. Have y'all registered to vote, damn it? All right, don't forget. I got my voters pamphlet in the mail yesterday, and it's about 75 pages thick, and who knew? There were so many offices people wanted to serve in. Anyway, I'm just going to skip over these just to say it. The biggest one here is really vitamin C, which is ascorbic acid, and people push and push and push for people to take vitamin C, but it just goes right through you and you pee it out. The best thing about taking way too much vitamin C is it will acidify your urine. So if any of you folks get kidney infections, a lot of times doctors will put you on lots of vitamin C, which acidifies your urine. And bacteria can't live in acid. So by taking vitamin C, acidifying your urine, it kills the bacteria in your bladder and makes you all better. Our diet in America, too much fat, too much calories, too much lipids, too much salt. That contributes to all these really terrible diseases that you can see listed right there. And I think I've said enough about that. I think we've talked about that stuff, so let me talk about this for a minute. Let's talk about calorimetry. Now, this is not colorimetry. Colorimetry is where we measure colors, right? Calorimetry is where we measure calories. So you put a McDonald's hamburger in a little box and you burn it up till it's nothing but ash, and you see how much energy did it give off. And And you can measure that energy, and then you can figure out how many calories were in that hamburger. That's what a calorimeter is. A couple points that are important for you to know is what is the definition of a calorie? A calorie is the amount of energy that it takes to raise 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. Now remember that degrees Celsius are almost twice as big as a degree Fahrenheit. 9/5, right, is a relationship between the two. But a gram, is a little box about that big, 1 centimeter on each side. It's 1 ml or 1 cc, cubic centimeter, full of water is when it weighs a gram. That's a calorie. But when we talk about calories, like you talk about how many calories there are in a hamburger, you're not talking about them. You're talking about kilocalories. You're talking about 1,000 calories. So 1 calorie, like we talk about in terms of diet, is what it would take to take a kilogram of water. A kilogram of water is a box about this big, 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters, also called a liter. Fill that up with water. The energy necessary to raise that 1 degree is a kilocalorie. Okay? We've already talked about these. Lipids, 9 calories per gram. Carbos, 4.9. Proteins, 4 points. So just 4, 4, and 9 is all you got to know. Let's talk about metabolic rate. We would like to think that we all burn the same number of calories, but that is totally untrue. You can measure your metabolic rate in many ways. You can measure it in calories per hour, calories per day, calories per unit of body weight. A lot of this stuff is measured in meters squared of surface area. In other words, how much skin you have. Just know that the total metabolic rate, this is a test question, guys, so pay attention to this line here. Metabolic rate is the sum of all the anabolic and catabolic processes in the body, and obviously it changes according to your activity. Now, the way I remember this is that 2 years ago I rode my bicycle across America, and I would ride about 50 to 60 miles a day, and I was dragging a trailer and 150 pounds of bicycle and gear. We're going down the road, camping out every night, and it was great. Because I could eat like an absolute pig. And I could eat anything I could see. I would have a double omelet for breakfast with oatmeal on the side and toast and butter and jelly. And then, oh, by the way, can I have a piece of that blueberry pie with a couple scoops of ice cream on it? I mean, this was breakfast. And I still lost 30 pounds. What? Well, that's because my metabolic rate from riding a bike and pulling all that stuff, 3,000 miles, was burned a lot of calories. The trouble is, when I got back, I continued to eat like that, and I wasn't riding my bike anymore. Anyway, BMR is the basal metabolic rate. This is a different thing. And you need to know one fact about the BMR. The BMR is your basic resting energy requirements. Okay? You can't be asleep to measure the BMR. You've got to be awake and alert, but you're not exercising at all. You're just sitting there. Okay? And so those are, and the temperature is 72, and the humidity is normal and all that good stuff. Now, how do we really measure BMR? The way you measure BMR scientifically is you hook these people up to usually you put a mask on them, and it feeds in oxygen, and they breathe it, and then they breathe out oxygen, and they breathe it right back into the mask. And what this testing does is it says it's able to figure out how much oxygen did you actually consume into your body, okay? So the BMR is measured, and it's calculated, and it's proportional to the amount of oxygen that you consumed, Okay, so it's basically a measure of oxygen consumption. Obviously, if you are running or riding your bicycle, you're breathing harder, you're breathing in more oxygen, you're eating up that oxygen, you're using that oxygen, and that's a higher BMR. Okay? Let's talk quickly about thermoregulation. I think this is another one of those things we started on about day 2 of A&P as well. Anything that we don't use, any energy that we don't use, our body has to deal with it as heat. And and heat is important because we have to stay warm all the time, because if our temperature is even down 2 degrees, none of our enzymes work well. We can't make proteins, we can't clot our blood, we can't do anything at 96 degrees very well. We can't think very well at 96 degrees. And that's why all these people up on the mountain who usually die, is because they get a little bit hypothermic, their temperature goes down about 2 degrees, and suddenly they can't think well. And so instead of following their compass and going to the right, then going to the left, they go to the left, right, left over a crevasse, and they're dead. Most mountaineering accidents are caused by minor degrees of hypothermia and just bad judgment. We have to keep our body very close, and as I've said before. How do we do it? Well, if you need to raise your temperature, one way to do it is to eat more, and another way to do it is to exercise more, get your muscles working. I think I'll just leave that there. How do we get rid of heat? How do we get rid of extra body heat? 4 processes, and you probably had this in 8th grade science, I don't know. Radiation is heat that just radiates off of you. Conduction is if you put your tongue on the flagpole, and it gives up a lot of heat through your tongue, and you get stuck to the tongue, right? That's conduction. Convection is you keep a little breeze going over your skin, and that keeps pulling the heat off because the air is constantly changing. And then, of course, evaporation is a great way to get rid of heat, because each milliliter of water that evaporates off your skin takes with it, 540 calories of heat. Tremendous amount. Evaporation is a great way to lose heat. I'm just going to skip through those things because I think that's enough. One of the things we'll talk about more in the next unit is water losses. We are losing water all the time right through our skin. Even though we don't see ourselves sweating, and my hand doesn't look like it's sweating, but yet I'm still having water come right out through my skin out into the environment. Okay. Now, that's about 20%. I think it amounts to about 300 cc's a day that we lose in what we call insensible water loss. We lose a lot more through sensible perspiration. In fact, you can sweat up to 4,000 cc's an hour if it's a hot day and you're exercising a lot. So that's why the runners in the marathons are always being offered water along the way, especially if it's a warm day, because they can just need so much of it. How do we control our heat? We control it in our brain. It's in our hypothalamus. Remember the hypothalamus? There's a heat control center in there, and I think that's all you need to know about it. The body actually has little thermometers, so to speak, little heat sensing things in the blood. As the blood passes through the hypothalamus, the temperature of the blood is red, and then the hypothalamus makes adjustments for that to either get rid of more heat or get rid of less. How do we do it? Well, we've already said you can either make more or you can alter the amount of heat you're giving off. But what are the best ways? One of the best ways is to have peripheral vasodilation. In other words, if all the blood vessels in your hand and your arms and so forth are bright red, and your skin turns red, that's because you're running a whole bunch of blood past your skin. And if you're running blood past your skin, you're giving off heat. And so that's why when you're running and it's hot outside, your skin will often look red. Whereas if you're outside and it's cold and you don't want to lose heat, your skin will probably look very pale, as if there's no blood flowing through your skin. And that's indeed your body is shunting the blood to the deeper tissues so you don't lose it, so your temperature doesn't go down. I think that's sweat is obviously controlled by your hypothalamus from your brain. If you need to lose heat, you sweat so that sweat can then evaporate and take a lot of heat with it. And also your depth of respiration changes. Now, have you ever watched a dog in the summer? Well, dogs don't really sweat. The only way they have to get rid of heat is to pant. So they're sitting there going, now why don't they lower their PCO2 and get all alkalotic and faint because they're hyperventilating? Well, it's because they aren't taking deep breaths. They're taking shallow breaths. They're just breathing back and forth their dead space. Remember we talked about dead space? So if you're taking shallow enough breaths that you aren't actually changing the air down in your alveolus, you're just doing, you can give up heat without blowing off too much CO2. Kind of cool, isn't it? Cool. I think I've said enough about temperature. In cold conditions, blood flow to the skin is restricted. Duh, makes sense. This is a concept here that I'll just mention quickly because we're going to come back to it when we get to the renal system. It's called countercurrent multiplication. Here it is right down here, countercurrent exchange. It works kind of like this. Like, let's just say it's really hot outside. And so we've got all of these superficial veins that are full, and they're taking lots of blood out here to the surface. Okay? We want to get rid of that. We've got arteries deep down inside here too. And what we've got to work in both directions. That's why they call it countercurrent. So as the blood goes back, it's giving off heat. And as the blood's coming out, it's giving off heat to these veins to get the blood in the veins even warmer so that they can radiate even more heat. We're going to see countercurrent multiplication in the kidney as a way we get rid of sodium and concentrate our urine. But I would read, go check that out in the book as you go through that little, it's just a little paragraph or so. But understand what we mean when we say countercurrent. It's caused by one set of things carrying things one way, and the one carrying it back, carrying it in the opposite way, and the two of them working on each other to make it more efficient. One of the things we do when we start getting really cold is we shiver. And if I can give you a little piece of advice from my Boy Scout times and from the little mountain climbing I've done, shivering makes you generate heat about 400% more. So it's really a good way to generate heat, but it's very expensive to you because you're burning up all this extra energy. And my advice is, if you ever start shivering ever in your life, the minute you start shivering, stop what you're doing, get yourself dry, get yourself in a tent, get yourself in warmer clothes, get yourself inside or something. Because when you start shivering, you're not far from getting very hypothermic. Because otherwise your body wouldn't be shivering. Your shivering is only going to keep your temperature up for maybe 10, 15 minutes. and then your temperature is going to start falling off, and that's a very dangerous, bad deal. So, when we were doing cold weather hiking and stuff, when somebody started shivering, that was the end of the hike. We were going to set up tents. If we had to get in 2 sleeping bags and get in there with them and hug them, that's what you did, because they had to be warmed up or they were going to get really sick really quick. The last thing I think I wanted to mention there, obviously epinephrine makes this stuff work like it does everything. Thyroid hormones have a little bit to do with speeding up your body metabolism to generate more heat as well. The last thing I want you to know about with temperatures, here's another word you ought to know about called acclimatization. What do you think that means? Acclimatize. Getting used to a new climate, right? When I was in the Navy, we were trying to figure out we were at the Naval Research Institute there outside of Washington at Bethesda, trying to figure out what can we do so that when we send soldiers over to Vietnam, they aren't worthless for 2 weeks, because they were worthless for 2 weeks. And so many of them would die in the first 2 weeks because they couldn't even think. They couldn't stand the 100 degrees, 100% humidity for a while, and they just did dumb stuff, and oftentimes were killed during that time. We thought, well, maybe if we just heat up the planes. So we started heating airplanes up, carrying soldiers to Vietnam to like 110 degrees for the whole 16-hour flight. Didn't make any difference. We had them start taking salt pills and drinking tons of water. Didn't make any difference. Nothing seemed to make any difference except just being there and being in the new climate for 2 weeks, and then you were used to it. So acclimatization, we'd like to think there was a way to make the adjustments quicker, but we can't, but they do occur over time, as it says there. Babies are the biggest problem with temperatures. When we would get a sick baby in the hospital out there in the Dalles, and that's 85 miles up the gorge, we would call for Life Flight, or we would call Dornbecker and have them send their mobile ICU, which was basically a fancy-dancy ambulance. And the problem with babies is they're so small, they have so little mass, but they have a lot more surface area, so their temperature falls off really quickly. And so generally they would never want us to transport the kids to them. They always wanted to come and get them. And as they drove up the gorge, they would heat up the inside of that ambulance to about 100 to keep those babies warm. And that's why you see kids in bassinets and incubators that are super warm in there, just to help them keep their heat, because kids have a lot of troubles keeping their heat just due to their small size. The one thing that kids have, infants and little kids have, that we adults don't have, is this stuff called brown fat. Now, it's located mostly across their back and between your shoulder blades and back in here. And it's not really brown fat. What it is it's fat that has lots of blood vessels in it. It's highly vascularized. And because it's so highly vascularized, it looks brown, okay? But it's just blood vessels in it. And the idea is they can burn their fat a lot faster than we can. They can burn this brown fat. And they use it just like we shiver. Babies can't shiver, but they can burn brown fat. And so that's what they can do to keep their temperatures up. But it's a limited thing. And usually by the time babies get to be about 6 months, their brown fat's pretty well all gone, and they lose that mechanism to keep themselves warm. So here it is. There are lots of adipocytes back there, fat cells innervated by sympathetic nerves. They can just cause them to go into lipolysis and start breaking down the fats right away. It can really help keep them warm. brown fat, really, adults don't really have any brown fat, but we do have the ability to shiver better, and that's a good thing. People that are heavy are better insulated. They can hold on to heat better. Last thing I think is that back in the day, when ladies wanted to know when they were pregnant or when they were ovulating, if they were trying to get pregnant, they would get up every morning and take their temperature at the exact same time every morning. Before they got out of bed, they had the thermometer beside the bed, they'd put it in for 5 full minutes and they'd write the temperature down, because when you ovulate, your temperature goes up for a couple of days. And it also goes down a little bit at night. But it enabled us to figure out when ladies were ovulating. And of course their husbands just loved that, because when they were ovulating was when you had to tell them, you had to give the husband the really bad news that now is the time to have sex if you're trying to get pregnant. Pyrexia is a name for temperature. Fever is high temperatures. I'll just leave it. That's the end of it. Okay. So we kind of blew through a lot of stuff there. I know the chapter's long. Just, there's a few things I said I think you ought to check. Be sure you understand what I'm talking about here or there. But that's it. That's it. Okay? So as of right now, we have covered all the material that will be covered on the test next Thursday. Both lecture and lab, although there's a bunch of eye stuff and some ear stuff that we haven't done yet that you guys ought to pay. I'll kind of try to lead you through that today, at least show you what you need to do. Am I in the wrong class? I'm in the wrong class. Yeah. I'm sorry. Digestion, respiration, and this. Yeah, that's 232. I gave them their first test today. They are totally freaking out. And class average was 74, I think, on the exam, which isn't bad. I try to shoot for about 78. But it's so funny. These really smart kids, I've had them before, and I know they're really smart. She says, I just made 75, Dr. Sessions. I can't stand it. I've studied so hard. She made 91. So, they're okay. They're just not near as smart as you 233 folks.